started. So thank you so much for joining us for the presentation today. We're going to take about 45 minutes plus the Q&A, but we're hoping you can save all your questions for the very end. If you could also make sure that everyone's muted, that would be fantastic. So 10 reasons why your brand should have a podcast plus how you can start. So in this 45-minute presentation, we're going to talk about what a branded podcast is, the 10 reasons why your brand should be podcasting, how your brand can podcast, what type of brand is right for podcasting, how to choose a production partner so that you can start podcasting. We're going to offer you a special offer, which we're super excited about. And then if anybody has any questions, we will, of course, cover that off. So who's going to benefit from this presentation? If you are professional leading brands looking to increase their engagement metrics with the ultimate goal of driving revenue, then this is the presentation for you. You know, podcasts are also going to be able to deliver a ton of value to your audience. So before we get started, we wanted to introduce ourselves. We are Jar Audio, and specifically, my name is Roger Nairn. I'm the CEO of Jar Audio. I've spent 18 years in the advertising world, both on the client side and the agency side. I've worked with some really exciting brands, including Netflix, Four Seasons, and Lamborghini. I really love working with brands that tell awesome, creative, engaging stories.
Hi everyone, my name is Paul Stewart. I'm head of outreach for Jar Audio, and I've spent 25 years in business development and sales. The first third of my career was focused on technology and media, including film and TV. The second part of my career was focused on impact and the environment, and the last third is back in software and sales. Thank you.
So Jar Audio uses podcasts to make meaningful connections between listeners and brands. We're really excited because, you know, we were one of the first in the industry to start producing podcasts with brands, but, you know, we've also been super lucky to work with some fantastic storytelling-based companies, including Lululemon, Expedia, Cineplex, and Vancity Credit Union. Plus, we have a whole bunch more in production as we speak. So let's start off with some definitions. You know, I'm going to go really quite broad to start out with. So bear with me if you're familiar with these. But let's start off with what a podcast is. Podcast has some key elements. So first of all, it's an episodic series. It usually involves spoken word. It is audio and it is digital. It involves niche topics, which is the great thing about podcasting. It could be entertainment, something comedy-based or drama-based. It could be about the news, education. Really, the list goes on and on and on. But the format is shifting. You know, it used to be just a mobile-based platform, but obviously we're seeing more and more usage in desktop and with smart speaker, which is really exciting. It used to also be audio only, but we're now seeing more and more audio video. And it used to be all about just downloads. Now we're seeing the likes of streaming through Spotify, for example. It also started as a free medium, and for the vast majority of them, they are still free. But we are seeing examples that are gated, where users are paying for a subscription. What is a branded podcast? Essentially, it's the exact same format than other podcasts, but in this case, it is owned and produced by the brand. Now, the shows are rarely mentioning the brand. You know, you might hear something off the top, like Out Travel a System, brought to you by Expedia. You might hear a bit of a mid-episode rebrand, and you would probably hear the brand mentioned in the sign-off. Throughout the rest of the show, though, for the most part, you know, we are not wanting to discuss the brand at all. Instead, we're talking about topics that just happen to have a tangential element to the brand. So it could be about hacking the travel world, which is obviously of benefit to Expedia, but we're not blathering on about Expedia products and Expedia this and that. It, of course, has to deliver a ton of value. And we always say that it has to almost go even further than other shows because it is a marketing medium. You know, listeners are you know, there is a layer of skepticism. So we just have to turn up the volume dial even more so and try to stay as focused on that as possible. And so, we try to be as entertaining, helpful, educational as possible. What is a branded podcast not? When we're talking about a branded podcast, we're not talking about advertising on a podcast. You can purchase ad space on a podcast. That's not what we're talking about. We're also not talking about like a rotating podcast sponsorship. So you might hear like, this Blue Apron podcast is brought to you, or sorry, whatever show it is brought to you by Blue Apron, but then the next month you might hear brought to you by MeUndies, or the next month you might hear brought to you by Casper mattresses. That's not what we're talking about in this case. What we are talking about is that the brand itself owns the show. And the way we like to think about it is that the brand has now become a broadcaster, just like other forms of content marketing, only in this case, it's a podcast. And really the brand is producing entertainment for its followers. This is just an example of some of the brands that have played in the branded podcast space. This is not exhaustive by any means, but we see, sort of innovative companies like a Tesla. But then we've also seen some of the more kind of, more traditional brands like a General Electric, who have produced fantastic shows, really, really exciting shows. Because what's old is actually new again. So in the case of General Electric, I mean, they were one of the first to introduce the whole idea of branded entertainment with the General Electric Theater, or you might be familiar with Procter & Gamble being responsible for the soap opera, and of course the Michelin Guide was one of the first forms of content marketing, as Michelin tires were were running around the countryside trying to educate their drivers that own their tires of the best restaurants to visit. And just a couple examples of branded podcasts. I mentioned GE. GE a few years ago came out with a fantastic show called The Message. Now, with it's owned by GE. What it is not is it's not a show that has nothing to do with medical devices or aircraft parts. What it is though is it's a fictional sci-fi series about messages received from space. And really what they've done is they've created this brand halo, where GE is synonymous with invention and innovation. Another example is Expedia. This is a show that Jar Audio actually produces. The show is owned by Expedia. What it's not is it's not promoting Expedia deals. What it is though is it's a show that gives travelers a sneak peek behind the curtain, arming them with insider tips, tricks, and hacks for how to get the best travel, or how to get the best out of their travel. And again, it's all about that brand halo. So Expedia is all about service, but they use their data and travel expertise to just be as helpful to the brand as possible. So what's really important with branded podcasts? I mentioned it before, we rarely mention the brand. The podcast itself, we actually recommend never running advertising during the podcast, but some do. I would say that if they were, it would be a podcast for maybe another podcast, and that's more of a strategic decision where we're trying to play off each other's audiences. But of course, it has to deliver value. That is absolutely key. So we're going to touch on why a brand should have a podcast. And we have 10 reasons to share with you. Paul's going to take over this part.
Thank you. There's 10 primary considerations when considering a podcast. Number one, podcasts are exploding. The number of listeners that are listening to podcasts continues to expand. Roger, do you want to go to the next screen? So for example, there's a great study called the Edison Research Infinite Dial. The hyperlink is at the bottom. They cover the United States, they cover Canada, they cover other countries as well. This is some of the best research we have seen. And so from a monthly basis, their research tells us that there's over 104 million listeners in the United States. Next slide. And it continues to grow every year. We will talk about COVID. We are seeing growth post-COVID as well. We will talk about that in a minute. But pre-COVID, we're seeing growth continuing in each cohort. You can see that from a demographic perspective that podcast listening definitely skews younger. But if you look at age 55 plus, it's also increasing as well. Canadians also listen to the same extent as Americans. So on a monthly basis, 37% of Canadians, which is equal to 37% of Americans listening. And then on a weekly basis, I think it's 24% are listening on a weekly basis. Podcasting has been embraced by some of the country's largest media content groups. And so what this means is that New York Times, who obviously are one of the leaders in this space, and others are offering this to their advertiser base, branded podcasts. And in conversations with New York Times, who are good friends of ours, Adam had mentioned in the next 3 years, he believes all major brands will have a podcast. Reason number 2, podcasts allow you to reach new audiences. So you're going to find that podcast listeners are well-educated, they're affluent, they're loyal to brands, they spend money on themselves, they treat themselves to massages and bottled water, etc. They love to learn, they're heavy social media users, and they're influenced by word of mouth. Number 3, you're going to hear this over and over again. Podcasts have high engagement levels. Now, this engagement level is seen from 2 different perspectives. Number 1, there's engagement value. So in this study by Westwood One, we learned that people consider listening to podcasts to be as valuable as listening to music, more valuable than watching videos and shows, and almost as valuable as checking the news. From an engagement perspective, we're lucky enough to see engagement or listen through rates of 90 to 95% of each of our 20-minute episodes. Now, while we think this is exceptional, it's actually common in the industry to see very long listen through rates on this media. When you compare that to video, which on average a YouTube video sees about a 50% watch through rate on 1 minute. We also believe that no other marketing channel has this high of an engagement rate. Number 4, podcasts can give you great ROI. So most marketing professionals scratch their head when it comes to measuring their content marketing ROI. You can measure financial ROI simply enough, just like you would with any other marketing medium. ROI being net profit divided by cost of investment times 100. Next slide. However, depending on your goals, you'll want to measure the content success. So on the next slide, we talk about the different types of ROI, right? And so naturally with the podcast metrics, you should be able to see enhancement to listens and downloads, engagement, listen length, as we just discussed, and reviews. But it will also enhance your web metrics, such as lead generation, site traffic, conversions, and SEO. And it will also enhance your brand metrics, such as improving awareness, authority, consideration, and purchase intent. So not all ROI is created equal. It very much depends on what your ROI goals are. Number 5, podcasts are an intimate medium. As a medium, podcasts have thrived because they're able to deliver the one thing that the internet and other mediums haven't been very good at, which is intimacy. So obviously, it's literally in your ear. It's like a whisper. It's the voice in your head. It's catered to personal preference, and it's mostly solo on your own time. Podcasts are portable. So naturally, you can listen to podcasts in the car, on the bus, subway, at the beach, walking the dog, at the gym, washing the dishes, that's my personal favorite, mowing the lawn, grocery shopping, working. So you're able to listen to podcasts while multitasking, which is not the same for YouTube and videos, etc. It's interesting that BBC did a research report called Activated, which the hyperlink is at the bottom there, that show that 94% of listeners consume podcasts while performing other tasks. And this mode of listening actually elevates engagement with the brand. What they found was that two processes occur in order to deliver this. Number one, keeping the brain occupied enhances the ability for brand messages to achieve cut through. This multitasking activity means that the podcast content is being taken in through low involvement processing, a much more fuel efficient process that has a lower cognitive load. As such, engagement with the content can last much longer, which is good news for this long form format. Reason number 7, podcasts are a pull medium. What this means is that listeners subscribe to the content. They actively seek out the content. They have an active interest in the material that they're listening to. And listeners invest their time, right? Podcast listeners spend an average of 6 hours and 37 minutes listening to podcasts every week. So if you compare the monthly listeners of about 37% of the population versus the weekly listeners at about 24% of the population, we know that the weekly listeners are listening to 6 or 7 podcasts series a week, right? And that's where you get the average of 6 hours and 37 minutes of listening.
And just to jump in here, when we talk about the long engagement rate as well, that combined with the fact that it's a pull medium, there's very few other forms of content where the user is actively looking forward to receiving it on a weekly or bi-weekly level, and then spending personal time with it as well. And even when they are interrupted or they are kept busy doing other things, that information is still seeping in, just like the BBC study shows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I very much find that with my subscriptions. As I subscribe to things and as new episodes pop up, I see them in my feed, and I'm always, it's like watching a new episode of Game of Thrones on HBO, right? It's like, as soon as it pops up, I'm like, oh, amazing, I can't wait.
Yeah.
Reason number 8, podcasts are great for internal communications also. So it's not just an external tool. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that here's an example of a podcast produced by, it looks like American Airlines. Tell me why. It can be privately distributed. You can have a direct link, you can post it on your intranet, and you can still have measurement options. So you can see what sort of percentage of your employee base is listening to the internal communications.
You can even track it so that you could tell which employee specifically has listened to the podcast or not. And I say that because if you want to use the podcast as an internal tool to train some of your staff or maybe onboard some of your staff, it's just a great way of understanding who has or hasn't participated in any of this training. Really something that is we're starting to see more of as companies adopt.
So the internal podcast, it's a great break from screen fatigue during the pandemic. We all know that emails and intranets go unread, plus they're very one-dimensional. They're delivered in a format that staff embrace on their own time. Again, the multitasking principle. It's fantastic for culture building, onboarding, and development. And it's delivered in a conversational style. So if you happen to choose to do an internal podcast with your senior leadership team, it's literally the voice in the head, right? There's all of the texture and innuendo that goes along with that voice. Reason number 9, podcasts are a flexible medium. So they're not constrained, right, by time. Joe Rogan's are sometimes 3 hours long. They're not constrained by format. The format that's most popular, obviously, is the interview style, but we're seeing dramatic I was going to say documentary narrated style formats becoming much more popular, taking the listener on a sort of a sonic journey. And then also a little bit more rare, but I think rather compelling is the dramatic fictional format becoming much more popular. Ad standards, not constrained by ad standards. We're seeing host read ads. We're seeing dynamically inserted ads. You're certainly not constrained by topic. There's over 1 million podcasts out there now, but there's still lots of room in terms of story spaces. And the shelf life, they definitely talk about the long tail. A lot of these series will last for years. And number 10, podcasts have continued throughout the pandemic. So audiences still want to be entertained. They want to learn a new skill or escape, now more than ever. Podcast consumption returned to pre-COVID numbers within 2 months. So we saw dips in March of 5%. And then we've seen in May a growth again in podcast listenership, 10% over January. So it's back to it's above its pre-COVID listener numbers. And that's, I think, part and parcel of the growth that we're seeing in podcasting. And the recording can be done remotely without sacrifice of quality. We have always recorded remotely, and we have our own proprietary audio recording system, which we deploy to guarantee highest quality. So we've been doing that during COVID, but not much has changed for us. Other than not having the ability to go into studio when you want, but we are recording remotely as we always have been.
So we've just covered the 10 reasons why brands should have a podcast. We now wanted to share how your brand can be podcasting. So when it comes to producing a podcast with a brand, like I mentioned this before, it's really all about delivering a ton of value. And the way to do that is to just focus, so much on the listener, understanding what they need, what they care about, and then of course what they listen to. One of the lowest hanging fruits when it comes to a podcast audience is other podcast listeners. So getting a good understanding of what other types of shows they're listening to is really important. So ask yourself, what can you teach? How can you help? How can you entertain? We are in the middle of quite a difficult time right now. A lot of people on a global level have lost their jobs. So we're going to see a lot of people looking to be reskilled, a lot of people that are looking for help and support. But at the same time, we definitely don't want to forget that people still need to be entertained. They still need to take a break from life. And like I mentioned before, a brand can play a role in that space. When it comes to branded podcasts, it's really going to take the right type of brand, though. Brands should have a clear-cut point of view. They should have the creative bravery to produce a podcast, and again, just be super focused on delivering as much value for their listeners. And really, what it comes down to when it comes to delivering value is quality. Being able to focus on a high production value, ensuring that you have the right host, whether that's somebody internally or whether that's a hired host, the right music. Music, it serves a range of functions. Not only does it set the tone for a show and the episode, but it also keeps the listener continuing on. It keeps the brain occupied, and it keeps listeners engaged. And again, we get that large engagement rate for a number of reasons. Music is one of them. That can both be stock or custom. You ultimately want to have multiple scenes in a show, and that could be, sort of a documentary style, but that could even be sort of a hosted interview style show. But when we say scenes, we mean breaking up the content into chunks again, so the brain has the ability to kind of switch and pivot and be woken up as the episode's going along as much as possible to keep it fresh and engaged as well. and craft just amazing stories. Stories stories are told in a number of medium. We believe that podcast can tell absolutely incredible stories, and they can come from brands. When it comes to quality, you can do it yourself, absolutely. But if you did want to choose a production partner, we definitely encourage that, because having an expert at the table is going to end up with a better quality show. So when we talk about a production partner, we look at we think that you should be able to pick a partner that provides you with 4 key areas of focus. And Paul's going to walk you through what those 4 key areas are right now.
Yeah, we wanted to offer almost like an agency checklist. So whether you're talking to JAR, or whether you're talking to anybody else about a branded podcast production, you'll want to include these 4 primary categories. I'm going to talk about the first 2. Number 1 is produce. Exactly. So you'll want to orient yourself towards audience first, right? We're trying to encourage brands to think about audience, not customer. We want you to put yourselves in the role of broadcaster, right? And to begin, we always start with a workshop. Pre-COVID, we'd hop on a plane, but now we do everything over virtual videos for the time being. And really what we'll be working on there is, number 1 is strategy, really trying to understand what sort of campaigns you're running this year, what are your brand pillars, what stories do you want to tell, what stories are your competitors telling, what other types of podcasts are in the space, are there any podcasts in the space, what is your format, is it interview, is it documentary, or do you want to do a fictional drama? If it's interview, what is your guest strategy? What is your season arc? A season is typically 6 episodes to start. So what will that arc look like? What will the format be, as I mentioned? Next slide. So again, yeah, we've talked about the formats earlier on. So would you want to, in the early workshops, we would talk about, do you want to have an interview-based podcast, which is really driven by question line scripts, which are just questions that really get under the hood. It's a cheaper type of format, of course, in terms of production costs. Narrated gets a little bit more complicated in terms of production, because there may be more people to interview. There may be on location audio that we record. The editing is a little bit more intense. It's something that you might hear on like NPR or in Canada CBC on Sunday morning. Or if you're talking about fiction, like if you really want to stand out and be bold, we'd encourage you to consider fiction or science fiction, drama, because here really the sky's the limit. We offer a turnkey system, and any production partner you want to inquire, what is their MO? Ours is turnkey. And the reason we like turnkey, and we think that the market believes there's a tremendous amount of value with turnkey, is that it saves you so much capacity in your marketing and communication teams. Because, for example, in the case of JAR Audio, we do all of the research, we do all of the writing, we can scout and hire your host. If it's an internal host, we can train them. We do all the recording. We can source or create custom music. We do all the sound editing. We do all the hosting and distribution, and other ancillary services we offer. We also offer promotion as well. But these are the types of things you'll need from any podcast production partner. Depending on the format, a 6-episode season should usually take about 1 to 2 months to produce the first 2 episodes. If it was an emergency because of COVID, that happens from time to time, we have heard that in the market, then we can produce slightly faster. But on average, it takes about 1 to 2 months to produce the first 2 episodes. And then we release each additional episode every 1 to 2 weeks. You're going to want to consider a cadence, a frequency of every 1 to 2 weeks. You can do monthly, although it's a little bit more difficult to build an audience on a monthly cadence. And then in terms of our calculations about all of the roles and all of the work to be done on podcast production, that the client needs to make themselves available for about a total of 6 days of work over this 4 to 5 month period. So in terms of capacity, particularly in the turnkey model, there's not a lot of work that needs to be done on your end. There is some front end work with the kickoff workshops where we define strategy, et cetera, which can take, half day to 2 days. And then from there, it's about 2 hours a week. And then there are some approvals. But other than that, there's not a huge amount of time that's required on part of the client. Push. So again, we push out the show and its episodes out to the podcast world. And it's actually not that complicated. We handle the setup, the management, and the maintenance of the online podcast server. We happen to use Omni Studio. It's owned by a large organization called Triton Digital. It's quite innovative. It's quite stable. It's got great user interface. Next slide. And the advantage of the podcast server is that it doesn't just push out the podcast to all the podcast players like Apple and Spotify and Overcast, et cetera, but it also will track all of your analytics, not just your downloads, but your engagement analytics as well. It'll track your listener reviews. You can also embed the player on your website or on specific landing pages. And it also has social links for social promotion as well.
So then we're, now that we've pushed the show out to the world, we want to pull in all that data. And so using that same host software, in our case, we use Omni, we're able to see real-time data of the show, and then we interpret the results. And any agency that you work with should be able to do the same. Now, all that data is really important, excuse me, because we use that data to then improve the performance of the show. So it could be gaining a better understanding of the analytics, which are going to include everything from download numbers, the subscribers, the reach. We're able to see all the reviews. We're able to look at the demographics, and we're also able to see the geography around the listeners, all the way down to the city, which we can then use to perhaps change any of our marketing plans, but also, excuse me, change the content in the show itself. We're then also able to use the consumption data. The consumption data tells us everything about the listening of the episodes themselves. We're able to see verified plays, the average time spent watching or listening. We're able to see retention. Where did we see people start the episode? Where do we see people drop off the episode? Where do we see people skip the episode? And that information is important because it tells us perhaps maybe the content is maybe a little bit boring in some spots, or maybe we've included a certain feature of the show that is of no interest to that listener, or they found a certain type of guest, perhaps of no interest or off-putting. It's all just data that we factor in. It's not the end-all be-all, but it is really important to embrace all that data and use it in your decision-making. Finally, the fourth category that any agency that you work with should be able to offer is promote. Now, gone are the days where you can build it and they will come, produce a podcast, put it out in the world and have it go viral. Paul mentioned there are 1 million podcasts out there right now. However, there is some really key important things that you can do to promote your show to ensure that you're going to get as large of an audience as possible. And the first, we look at it sort of from 6 main buckets. The first is marketing. That's where you're going to look for partnership opportunities with certain media companies and social platforms to promote the show. The second is PR and earned media. That's where you're acting like a publicist. If we were a movie studio, we would reach out to the media and try to get them to write on our movie. In this case, we're trying to get them to write on the podcast. There are more your traditional media, like like newspapers and TV and whatnot, and then there are podcast-based media that also report on podcasts, and then there's like very niche-based media depending on the topic of the show. If we're talking about the Expedia podcast, we reach out to all the travel writers and try to get them to talk about the show. So any agency that you're speaking with should be able to develop a plan around that. The third is what we call spotlight. Now, there's a big misconception in the industry that in order to get featured at the top of Apple Podcasts, for example, you have to game some sort of algorithm. The reality is that all those decisions are editorial based. They're decisions made by humans. And so you're able to pitch those humans on why your show deserves to be featured. Now, they will feature shows that have high download rates. There's no doubt about it. But also, if you have a certain show that you think is worth talking about because perhaps it's a special time of the year, or perhaps there's a certain cluster of podcasts that you might want to pitch them on bunching together. So for example, there's a lot of African-American based podcasts right now, which are being featured because of everything going on in the world right now. There's also a lot of COVID clusters of podcasts that are being featured through Apple Podcasts. It's really sky's the limit on how you pitch them and why you pitch them. So it's good to just lean in on what your topic is and craft something to go at them with. The fourth area is cross promotion. So we talked about the low-hanging fruit of podcast listeners. So we try to figure out what other podcasts is our audience listening to, and see where the synergy is, and then approach them and see if there's an opportunity to perhaps swap guests or swap hosts. So maybe they interview our host, we interview theirs, or perhaps we take a snippet of their interview or of their episodes and we include it in our show, and vice versa. We've even seen opportunities to take episodes and include it in our feed so that it acts as sort of like a special episode to share. There's also paid opportunities. So there are opportunities to promote the show through the social channels, but then there are also opportunities to promote the show in different podcast players. Again, low-hanging fruit, speaking to podcast listeners. So there are ways of getting the show into their ears, or in the case of some of the podcast directories, there's display opportunities. And then the sixth category we like to call kind of the more category, which is all about kind of your creativity and where the opportunities are to share the show. We always like to talk about leaning into your unfair advantage as an organization. Do you have a massive newsletter that goes out that you would be able to talk about the podcast in? Or maybe if you're a nonprofit, you've got a large flock of volunteers. They would love to hear about your podcast. In the case of like a Cineplex, which is a large movie theater chain, they obviously have the movie screens. Like where can we talk about the show to get as much audience as possible? So at the same time, you also want to factor in that you have a whole ecosystem around your show that you need to consider, including the artwork, any sort of landing page or microsite that goes along with the podcast. Podcast listeners love more information. So if they're really into your episode, you're going to want to provide additional information. Social content. So to promote the show, maybe you want to tease some of the future episodes, or maybe provide more information on the host or a guest or a certain topic. Being an ex-brand guy myself, I always want to make sure that our show artwork is very consistent and there is a look and feel to all of it. And then finally, social links. So the podcast player that you choose will provide you with social links. We would also encourage looking into what we would call smart links, which is a product of Chartable. reason you'd want to include smart links in any of your social posts is that if a user clicks on the smart link, it automatically opens up to their favorite podcast player, so that they can automatically start listening, or they can automatically subscribe. We want to, obviously encourage creating the best user experience as possible. This is just an example of some of the work that we've done. And so an agency should also be able to offer some other services that you want to keep in mind. The first is podcast advertising. We're talking about branded podcasts. We're talking about owning your own show. However, if you did want to promote, or if you did want to just purchase advertising on a podcast, that those agencies should be able to offer that. There's two ways of looking at podcast advertising. The first is baked in. That means that the advertisement is actually baked within the content and the show itself. It might be read by the host, or it might be inserted into the episode in some way, but it forever lives with that file. The downside of that is that should any of the content need to change, you're going to have to work with the podcast to switch up or do a reread. The other way of looking, the other way of purchasing advertising is dynamic ad insertion. And as it sounds, that's where it's dynamically being inserted into an episode. You're able to take advantage of the donuts that they're leaving in those episodes. And the great thing about that is you're able to target certain age groups or certain geography, dependent on what you're looking to accomplish by advertising on a podcast. And also the content can change quite easily because it is being dynamically inserted. So we want to, leave you with 6 questions that you should be asking any podcast agency on top of some of the services that we talked about. The first is, how do we get a dedicated project manager? A lot of times you'll be lumped in with a bunch of different people. It's really important, because this is a production process, to have one single point man available to contact. Otherwise, it can get a bit confusing. So definitely ask them that. Is the estimating clear? Podcasts, being a creative medium, have all sorts of different variables involved. It's really important that those are clearly communicated to you up front and clearly estimated. The invoicing should be flexible because of COVID right now. I know that is important for business. Ask them whether they collaborate. Some agencies will have a tendency to kind of squirrel away for a couple weeks and work on ideas, and then come back and have what I call a ta-da presentation, where you sort of are shown a bunch of concepts and you've got to choose one and then on to the next step. We really believe that it should be a collaborative process. You obviously understand your brand more than anyone. We obviously understand podcasting and storytelling better than anyone. So we want to be able to work together during the process to make sure that we're moving down the field together versus, us tucking away for a long time. You should also be provided with status reports as you move along, and also ideally are working within some sort of project management software. So make sure you ask those questions as well. So before we go, we wanted to just quickly give you a little more information about Jar Audio. So we are a creative studio using podcasts and other long form audio to make meaningful connections between people and brands. Our leadership team has a whole bunch of experience building brands, producing engaging digital content, and telling competitive stories. But we are supported by a massive team of creatives consisting of writers, recordists, sound editors, and audience growth strategists. It's really important for us that we match the right creatives with the right project. And so we actually work quite modularly. We have always worked remotely as well. So we have people all around North America that we tap into when it comes to the project based on the content and the type of project. That's important for us. But the consistency between the two is both our leadership team and our creatives come to the table with a lot of journalistic integrity and audio expertise. We offer all the services that we just shared with you, everything from strategy all the way down to we're even offering audio blogging, which is a way of taking your company's blog and turning it into audio so that can be portable, and time shift so that people can read or people can listen to on their own time. As well as other forms of long form audio. Doesn't matter what we do though, and the type of project we work on, we always make sure that it's creative, collaborative, and fun. We've worked with some fantastic brands, and we're super, super lucky to get to work with them. Paul, I think, is going to round us out here.
Yeah, so just to close, in terms of moving forward, whether you're a brand or whether you're an agency partner, one thing to keep in mind is that we're a full service agency, but our services are scalable, right? So if, for example, there's a brand that has a super strong comms team and they want to lean in on writing or want to lean in on strategy, or if there's an agency partner that we're working with that wants to lean in on strategy or promotion, we're scalable and we can fill in gaps as well. In terms of pricing, on average, like keep in mind we're bespoke, and so we do tailor our projects to more episodes, fewer episodes, a longer number of minutes, fewer number of minutes. But on average, a season is typically 6 episodes. They're on average about 20 minutes. We can go longer, we can go shorter, of course. 20 minutes being average because the pre-COVID commute in North America is 27 minutes on average. And so I think that is where the origin of 20 minutes really came from. And we charge on a per delivered minute basis about $400. And so 6 episodes times 20 minutes times $400 is about 48,000. That's everything except for a host. We would encourage a professional host in the majority of cases, unless there's exceptional internal people that want to get involved. But there's an inventory of well-qualified, normally ex-radio hosts who can step in as professional hosts, as facilitators, and they typically charge $1,000 to $2,000 an episode. So it's not insurmountable. If they're a celebrity, it's quite a different story. And then promotion obviously would be separate. And then roughly 4 months to complete production and season release. It can be 4, it can be 5, it can be quicker if necessary, with the goal of releasing the first couple of episodes within 1 to 2 months. Best next steps is usually a 30-minute call, which we can arrange digitally. And we would encourage you to reach out if you're interested in chatting in more detail. You can either go into my calendar directly at jaraudio.com/book-a-chat, or hit me on my cell or email. Would love to talk to you in more detail.
Before you go, and we will be sharing this deck with you, we wanted to offer you something to learn more about the podcasting world. We've created the ultimate guide to podcast statistics that we think all brands should learn about. So we've created a site that you're able to access exclusively to see both the Canadian and American podcast statistics and facts. And it's updated as of the month of June. So it's really worth your time to check that out because some of that information is really key, especially if, when we're talking about brands. Thanks so much for joining us, Paul, and I really, really appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions before we go? Oops, let me. Any questions at all? No, okay. Once again, thank you so much. We will be sending you this presentation. If you have any questions at all or would like to talk about any ideas or next steps, please don't hesitate to reach out to Paul. Thank you so much. Hope everyone stays healthy and safe.
Thanks so much for your time. Have a great day.